My name is Judy Frick, and I am one of 5 Junior League members conducting nonprofit board development training. All of us are certified as consultants through BoardSource, a national organization dedicated to supporting nonprofit boards with tools, publications, and training. In addition to conducting training for Junior League members and the Nonprofit Chambers Board University, we are also able to provide sessions and consultations for nonprofit community boards. In the case of succession planning, I happened to do a year-long fellowship with National Communities Schools on this topic, and then ended up doing a lot of consulting with CIS affiliates. So if you are interested in a full session on succession planning, please contact me directly at 316-204-8464 or jcfrick@cox.net. For this particular presentation, we have 2 tools which are included: an overview of executive transition management and an emergency succession plan template. I feel it's important to always have a plan to ignore. And unfortunately, that's what happens with a number of plans, strategic plans as well. Succession planning and leadership transition require multiple steps to be successful. It is a process and it involves way more than a search. So why is this important? First of all, we're talking about organizational sustainability. If you don't have a plan and there is a transition, I think many of you realize that transitions are fraught with risk and often don't work out. So it really is important to have a plan in advance so that you can make the transition comfortably and maintain your organization's level of ability to function. Obviously, it's an opportunity to grow. When a transition occurs, it possibly can mean a time to change direction, to have a fresh perspective, to rethink the organization. And it is a best practice in regard to community impact. If our organizations are stable during a transition, they are much more likely to be successful in serving their clientele. Succession planning involves leadership and talent development. It is interesting to note that there are 78 million baby boomers and 38 million Generation Xers. You do the math. There aren't going to be enough people to assume these leadership positions unless we do a lot in the area of leadership and talent development. Another aspect of succession planning concerns next generation attitudes. Generation X, perhaps, are not as workaholic oriented as the current baby boomers. And they seem to feel it's important to have a work-life balance. Are you prepared? How many of you have discussed succession planning with your board chair or CEO? And you might say, well, as a board chair, if I suggest this to the CEO, he or she is going to think we want to get rid of them. Or the CEO may think, if I discuss this with my board, they may think I'm planning on leaving. And I guess to that, I would say, get over it, because the discussion really needs to take place so that you do have a plan. You have no idea what might happen if suddenly the CEO walked out the door. What would be your greatest concerns in that case? And, it could happen. I mean, CEOs become ill. They might win the lottery and go on a around the world trip. One never knows what's going to happen. So it's very important to have a plan. For the purposes of succession planning and leadership transition, I really recommend the executive transition management model, and it works in all kinds of transitions, whether it's a planned departure or whether it is an emergency one. And there are 3 phases to this. The first is to prepare. In that phase, you focus on leadership. Who is going to take the lead on the organization when the executive leaves unexpectedly or in a defined departure? Are you going to have an acting director or an interim director? And you need to create a search and transition committee and begin planning and assessing the organization. The next phase, pivot. You need to assess the organization and strengthen the weaknesses, and the search is also a part of this. When you talk about assessing the organization, we're talking about assessing the board and the staff as a part of this assessment. And all of this information will help you in choosing a new executive and in looking at the priorities of the organization. It will determine what kind of person is needed to lead the organization. When you talk about strengthening, what does the organization need to do to strengthen itself? Are the systems in place, or are they all in the executive's head? And that doesn't work very well. What are the strategic priorities of the organization? What kind of shape is the board in? How can it be strengthened? And then there's the search. Don't rush this process and don't settle. Even if you do a complete search and you've gone through the whole process and you're not satisfied with the candidates, then start over. I know it seems like an enormous task, and it is, but if you don't hire the right person, you will end up probably a few months later making another transition, and it's simply not worth it. It's very important for people, board members, to do social networking in doing the search, because that really is where you come up with the best candidates. If you think about it and ask people and let people know you're in the process of a search and you really would need some input to do this correctly. It just works better than ads in the paper. And do very thorough reference checks. Too many times this process is short-circuited and there are not enough opportunities for board members to meet the candidate and make comments. And when board members meet the candidate, be sure you follow up with them to determine what they thought. And the last phase, 3, is thrive. Prepare, pivot, thrive. And that is monitoring the transition. It seems like once you've done this search and you've worked so hard, it's like, can't the executive now just take over? We're done. We need to go back to our day jobs. But it's very important to monitor this transition and have really good communication with the new executive, and have the priorities written down, and maybe like a social contract between the board and the executive, which clarifies expectations on both sides. The succession basics include the succession policy, which outlines succession procedures, the emergency succession plan, a leadership development plan, and an inventory. The emergency succession plan includes several parts. First of all, you need to name who might serve as an acting director, and it's usually like a staff person or maybe even a board person might serve, or if you decide on an interim, that's another possibility. Obviously, an updated job description is very important that really reflects what the executive is currently doing. Priority functions. What functions absolutely need to occur for the organization to continue to operate? And then there's a communications plan. Who needs to know that the executive is leaving, and how will we contact them? Via email, via phone, via special meetings? And then key relationships need to be included in the plan. Who are your donors, your key funders, your partner organizations? All of those need to be informed that a transition is taking place. And calendars. And many of you have calendars so you can reconstruct what your important tasks are. But I had one that really worked very well that was like one page for every month, and it had 3 columns. In the left-hand column were the administrative tasks relating to the board and the staff, when the meetings were, what kind of professional development, all of that kind of thing. In the middle column was the program, all of the proposals and things that needed to be done, reports and so forth, by a certain time. And then in the right-hand column, I had resource development, and that included fundraising, key timelines, marketing and PR activities, as well as possibly volunteer management if you happen to be utilizing a great deal of volunteers. And then the inventory. The inventory needs to be attached to the succession plan. And it has all of those things like passwords, the key to the storage room, where the information on insurance policies or the facility, all of those things, where are they kept? Ideally, this would be done electronically, but obviously there's probably also going to be a paper trail. The Leadership Talent Development Plan is crucial to your effort in succession planning. And frankly, whether you're doing succession planning or not, organizations need this kind of plan. It is a recruitment plan for board and staff. And if you know what kinds of skills that you need to run your organization, both from the board and staff perspective, it's very helpful to include those in the plan. Then, organizational and individual plans. In regard to the individual plans, many of the objectives can be included on the annual performance review. A cross-training plan, which will give staff members an opportunity to do different duties and activities, things that they may not do during their regular job, but in the case of a transition might be extremely helpful for them to know how to do. It's always helpful to have a backup in this area. The annual bench strength review is something that needs to be done so you know what your status is as an organization. And then planned opportunities to help people develop their talents. Giving people opportunities, for example, to make a presentation, to do special kinds of duties, to attend community meetings and learn more about the background for the organization and what's needed. All of those are very helpful kinds of opportunities. And many times these things are free. There are at one point, I know that Bridgespan, which is a national organization, had 52 ways to do staff development, one for every week in the year. And obviously a budget. I mentioned that some things are free, and there really are a lot of inexpensive kinds of training, but it does require some funds to be able to do leadership talent development. So to summarize, succession planning and leadership transition are a process with multiple steps and requiring extensive board engagement. It's important to have a succession policy, a plan, a leadership development plan, and an inventory. And it also is most helpful to follow the phases of the executive transition management model. And frankly, this is really good for most kinds of changes in an organization, whether it just happens to be not an occasion when you need to have a succession plan, but you're in the process of hiring. With the hiring and the transition, an executive transition management model can be extremely helpful. Thank you.